America's most beloved benefit program is at risk. President Trump took aim at Social Security Tuesday during his address to a joint session of Congress. He falsely claimed the program has, quote, shocking levels of fraud and sends checks to 150-year-olds. To be clear, that's not true. A recent Inspector General report found less than 1% of Social Security payments are improper, and most are overpayments to eligible people. And while there are about 90,000 seniors over 100 years old receiving Social Security benefits, and the names of deceased Americans are still in the database, there is no evidence checks are being sent to thousands of them, as Trump claimed. Today, the program supports 72.5 million retirees and people with disabilities. But the Trump administration is already threatening delivery of Social Security benefits by reducing staff. Last week, the acting Social Security administrator offered buyouts to employees and announced plans to slash 7,000 jobs. And more attacks could be coming from Doge leader Elon Musk, who's called Social Security a scam.
Social Security is the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time. Like, if you look at the future obligations of Social Security, it far exceeds the tax revenue.
Joining me now to fact check is Martin O'Malley, former commissioner of the Social Security Administration and former governor of Maryland. Administrator O'Malley, Governor O'Malley, thank you for coming to the Saturday show. So you just heard Elon Musk talk about Social Security. What, if anything, that he said is true?
Well, very little, nothing, as far as I can tell. I mean, he was the one that initially started this falsehood about there being some zombie apocalypse and, you know, millions and millions of people walking dead all over, you know, the United States with Social Security money coming out of their cadaverous pockets. That was false. And then Donald Trump doubled down on it and said, no, they're not just 150-year-olds, they're 300 years old. Presumably, they came here for the founding of Jamestown. His latest thing about this being a Ponzi scheme is also false. In fact, if Social Security were a Ponzi scheme, it would not be running for 90 years without ever missing a benefit payment. Social Security is a pay-as-you-go program. And it is true that the surplus reserve that was built up to last the lifetimes of baby boomers like me is being depleted sooner than anticipated in 1982. But that can be fixed, just as they fixed the 75-year forecast back in 1982. So Social Security, however, the biggest threat that it faces, Jonathan, is actually the staffing cuts, the slashing of Social Security, the gutting of Social Security. We are already seeing the wait times for every service line going up, up, up in the wrong direction after a year of getting it to go in the right direction. We are also going to see intermittent disruptions of a lot of the IT aspects that process the claims. Earlier today, I was at a rally here in Florida, and people were saying that they were getting locked out of their MySSA account. So you're going to see those things happen with greater frequency. And then because they're literally paying people to leave now, they'll pay them for a whole year if they're retirement eligible to get out and to get out now. No knowledge transfer. So what that's eventually going to lead to is a cascading effect that I believe will see manifest itself in an interruption of benefits sometime in the next 30 to 90 days at this rate.
And I was about to ask you about that because on March 1st on CNBC, you said the benefits are likely to be interrupted in 30 to 90 days. And you said, quote, people should start saving now. I missed a little bit of what you said, but do you stand by that forecast, that 30 to 90 days or less?
I do. I mean, you're already seeing some of the, some of the precursors of that. Jonathan, there is an office in Social Security, which I had the honor to lead last year, dedicated people. There's an office called the Office of Benefits Information Systems. These are the people that make sure that complex, fragile IT system, which is based on a very old COBOL sort of foundation, they are the ones that make sure that the benefits go out. They're the ones that update the COLAs. The cost of living increases in October. They pull a week of all-nighters. But guess what? About 40% of them are retirement eligible, which means they're being told by the Musk Doge team at Social Security, we will pay you for the whole year if you leave right the heck now. And don't let the door hit your backside on the way out. That's irresponsible. If you did that in any IT company as the CEO, the board would fire you. These guys are wrecking the Social Security Administration. They are gutting it of staff, and they are driving its IT systems into a situation where you are going to see a total system collapse in the next 90 days ahead of us.
And real quickly, Governor O'Malley, then will they have reaped the whirlwind? Because I'm old enough to remember when there was an issue with Social Security. I think it was back in the late 80s, early 90s, when retirees were climbing on cars of members of Congress protesting something that had happened to their benefits. Are we likely to see that from this generation's retirees?
Well, if the crowds that I've been seeing down here, I've been in Florida today speaking at town halls around the Tampa area. I plan to come back. I believe that there is a popular public backlash coming that they don't even know yet, just how what that backlash is going to be. People are very concerned. They are very zeroed in. And by the size of the crowds I see here, I think there will be that public backlash.
Martin O'Malley, thank you very much for coming to the Saturday Show.
So let's bring in Sophia Kai, White House reporter for Politico, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters, and Lauren Hirsch, New York Times reporter covering business and policy. Welcome all. Jeff, before I get to tariff talk, what are you hearing about the government shutdown next week? Will it be averted?
Well, I think they want to avert it. I think this White House is well aware that usually government shutdowns politically end up hurting the incumbent or the person who's in the White House more than the opposition party, so more than Democrats in this case. That said, there are no guarantees in Washington, and there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. And the president showed in his first term a remarkable willingness to shut the government down, even when it ended up hurting him politically. So TBD, Alex, but I think we want to avoid it, and I think the lawmakers on the Hill want to avoid it as well.
So, Jeff, is it clear what forces are at work when the president one day imposes tariffs, then lifts them, then threatens higher tariffs? And what do you make of Howard Lutnick's tone? He seems like a cheerleader, but is he providing a realistic picture?
Well, let me answer your first question first. What forces are at work? It's the forces inside President Trump's brain. And I'm not being facetious there. He goes back and forth. He has a phone call with the Mexican leader and then decides to be more gracious about it with her and her country. He hears from car makers and then decides to give them a reprieve for a month. And yet that was the same dynamic at the beginning of this process when he gave a 30-day reprieve for all of the tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And then, of course, as you just discussed, they went into effect this week. Or last week, rather. So, he goes back and forth based on the advice or the conversation that he has had most recently and then makes those decisions. As far as Commerce Secretary Lutnick, I mean, he's a fan of tariffs, too, because he works for Donald Trump. And their logic and the logic that he was articulating refers specifically to the reciprocal tariffs, which are supposed to come into effect in April. And the logic that he was explaining there is if we show the rest of the world that we're just going to match your tariffs, whatever tariffs you already have on the United States, then that's going to drive those countries to change theirs. That logic is perhaps a little bit more logical than some of the other tariffs that President Trump has been discussing. That doesn't mean it's going to work the way he wants it to, but that's what they foresee, or that's at least what they want to see happen.
So, Lauren, the Wall Street Journal apparently not buying what's being sold here because the editorial board called for someone to sue President Trump, challenging his right to impose tariffs without congressional approval. Is there a sense these tariff moves will erode Trump's support from Wall Street and from big businesses because they will damage the economy overall?
It's a great question. Donald Trump cares a lot about what Wall Street thinks, what the stock market thinks. And what we've seen so far is the market has reacted very poorly to the threat of these tariffs. And beyond that, they've been unable to make any kind of decision. They haven't done deals. They haven't made investments. There is so much uncertainty about what tomorrow brings, what the next hour brings, that it's really tempered down on CEO confidence. And there is this big question as to at what point does that really restrain Trump's relatively volatile approach to tariffs.
And Sophia, part of the economic story is the ongoing job cuts by Elon Musk. And your colleagues at Politico, they followed up on a New York Times report on a clash between Elon Musk and Marco Rubio. And here's what the president said about it when asked.
No clash. I was there. You're just a troublemaker. And you're not supposed to be asking that question because we're talking about the World Cup. Elon gets along great with Marco, and they're both doing a fantastic job. There is no clash.
Is there any sense Musk could start getting pushed out of the picture, or is he here to stay?
You know, I think that he's really here to stay because what he brings to the table is not just, you know, in his words, technical support. It's the hundreds of millions of dollars that he could spend in the next midterms. You know, that's a tool that they can use to wrangle lawmakers on the Hill. And Musk also brings with him an immense amount of social media influence. And I think that's something that Trump's cabinet acknowledges. And again, so Trump doesn't mind chaos. He's someone that, you know, acknowledges that Musk has a mission that he wants to do, which is to cut the federal government. And he also knows that Musk cannot run the agency. So he has to keep the cabinet happy, which is why you saw President Trump come in to defend Marco Rubio and say, look, the secretary is doing a great job.
Hang on, Sophia. It sounds a little bit crazy because what you're implying is that the money that comes with Elon Musk can be used to primary Republicans who oppose the position of this president. I mean, the intra-party, that's just crazy.
Yeah, and this is really unprecedented. I was just talking to somebody who works for America PAC, which is Musk's, you know, the primary vehicle that he can really weigh in on some of these elections. And I asked them, look, like how much money is left in this PAC? And what I was told was it really doesn't matter because at any given time, Elon can just contribute to it and top it off.
What is your reaction to that, Jeff?
Well, I mean, I enjoyed hearing you say, "Isn't that crazy?" I mean, is crazy to whom? You know, it's not crazy to Elon Musk. It's not crazy to Donald Trump. This is a reality. One of his top advisors is the richest man in the world. And who had a huge influence in terms of his financial support in the last election. And look, we've also seen, and not only seen, but we've heard the president talk openly about retribution, and that attitude applies not just to the opposition in terms of Democrats. It applies to people on his team, i.e. other Republicans who may oppose him. So the fact that that is a threat that's hanging over them, the financial piece, but also just the possibility of getting primaried, that is absolutely real in Congress right now. And I think it's no doubt one of the reasons that you haven't seen a lot of Republicans who may be leery certainly about Elon Musk and Doge, but also about some of the things that the president is doing, not stepping up to take those public positions.
I guess I use the term crazy because we are in such unprecedented, uncharted waters with this. It's stunning, and any number of other words you can use. I do want to ask you, Lauren, about an important article that you did on the Department of Justice investigating the price of eggs. What's that about?
It's very early stage. You know, we've all seen it when we've gone to the grocery market, the price of eggs has skyrocketed. And the biggest question that exists in these kinds of situations is, are the price of eggs up because of supply chain disruptions? There has been the avian flu, which has, you know, ravaged the industry, or is it because of collusion? And that is what the Justice Department wants to find out. It's very early stage, but they're preparing to send out effectively subpoenas for a civil investigation to learn a little bit more about the extent to which these companies have been information sharing and the extent to which, if they have, they've been using that to impact pricing.
So this investigation, Jeff, interpretation of it, do you think it's more about real potential price gouging, or is it for political appearances to make it look like the administration is trying to tackle the price of eggs and inflation, by extension?
I think it may be a little bit of both, and I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. You saw some of that during the Biden years as well, threatened or investigations, or at least acts to look into what they consider price gouging driving inflation. Right now, it's specifically on eggs. Eggs are such a good manifestation, I guess, of high prices when you're just looking for an easy example. And Americans are facing this in the grocery store every day. So I think that the Trump administration is under pressure to show that they're doing something about it. So the political piece to this that you're referring to, or that you're asking about, Alex, is real. They need to demonstrate that they're doing something. Will they find that there's price gouging? I don't know. It's hard to say. But is that a way to demonstrate that they're taking action? Absolutely. And is that necessary politically? Absolutely, again.
So is the expectation, Lauren, given the reporting that you've done with your team there, will it really help lower the cost of eggs, having this investigation?
Antitrust investigations obviously take a long time. But to Jeff's point, it's sending a message. And also to Jeff's point, it's certainly something that former President Biden's administration did too. When they see prices skyrocket, they're at the very least saying, we're watching your behavior. And I'm sure that CEOs, have also taken notice.
Mm-hmm. Sophia, I want to get to the Ukraine-Russia war with you, because there's a new NBC News report saying that Donald Trump now wants more than just a mineral deal. He also wants Ukraine to make other concessions for the U.S. to then resume their intel sharing and the military weapons flow. What's your read on that?
Look, I think ultimately President Trump is interested in a deal. That's always been his priority. I think he also wants to see one of his biggest legacies as a person who brings peace. And that's why that he's been so insistent that Ukraine, bring more to the table in the form of being willing to potentially give up some land, or in some way showing that they're more serious about peace. And so that's why, we hear U.S. officials today saying that it's not enough for us to be in the same place, last Friday, where Ukraine and U.S. was ready to sign the minerals deal. We're hearing from Trump and his team that they want to see more. And I think they're saying they've seen Ukraine come into a more positive direction, and they just want to see a little bit more.
Okay. Sophia Kai and Jeff Mason and Lauren Hirsch, thank you all three.
Joining me now is Congressman Al Green, Democrat of Texas. Congressman, you emphasized that your spontaneous protest of Trump's joint address was about the massive cuts he and Republicans are proposing to Medicaid as they slash through the government. Despite that, you were escorted out of the chamber and censored. The president has called you low IQ and an embarrassment. And the far-right House Freedom Caucus is trying to get you stripped of your committee assignments. I want to remind our viewers that you led the charge in Congress to impeach President Trump during his first term. Do you think that has factored in all of this?
Thank you for having me, Reverend. Of course I do. I think that the president, who is known for his desire to retaliate, is engaging in what he's known for. And I do believe that we have a responsibility, however, to protect Medicaid. Medicaid is all many people will have when it comes to health care. In Texas, we have about 20% of our population without health care, more than any other state in the country. Our children have an uninsured rate that is twice that of the national rate. So we have to protect Medicaid. And that was what that was all about, protecting Medicaid. And I am prepared to suffer the consequences. Protest, peaceful protest, is about getting in the way, as John Lewis put it, and also being prepared to suffer the consequences. But Reverend, that doesn't mean that I have to like the consequences.
Yeah, I heard you say that immediately after the censoring, and I identified with it. You talked about that's how many of us in the civil rights movement behaved. I've been arrested over 30 times, have done 3 months in jail, 45 days in jail, all for nonviolent protests, and you accept it. And you said you're not angry with Speaker Mike Johnson or members who voted for your censure, which included every House Republican and 10 Democrats, some of whom have complained that the protests during the president's address were uncivil, a mistake, and a distraction. But as I recall, you may have 2 House members with the last name Green who've protested during recent presidential addresses. Only the black one is being censored for it. Are Democrats being too civil during this time when American rights and freedoms are literally on the line?
Reverend, that's a great question. The president recognizes that we are being civil, and he uses his incivility to take advantage of our civility. I was dismayed, disappointed, and quite frankly, I was hurt to see the president of the United States indicate that the Democrats were lunatics, that we are lunatics. He did that on national TV at the joint session of Congress. He will not be censored. He will not be reprimanded. He will not be in any way placed in any kind of punishment. I think that we are finding ourselves in a position where we have to meet incivility with incivility. Now, Reverend, he does it to harm and demean, just as he has given me this nickname that he thinks is going to somehow besmirch my name or my reputation. We do it to uplift people. He does it to put people down and demean people. That's the difference. If you're doing it to uplift, to help people on Medicaid, to help people on Medicare, Social Security, save the Department of Education, protect veterans who are being fired, those who are at the VA and working, if you're doing it for these reasons, that's a righteous cause. And I think that we'll have to have additional incivility, which is another form of peaceful protest.
Now, the Democratic response to your protests and censure showed just how divided the party is over not just how to counter Trump, but how to craft also a compelling message to American voters ahead of our next election. Some Democrats have taken a combative stand with Trump, or they're using the courts to block his action. Other leaders are trying to find places they can compromise with the administration, or focusing on pragmatic message that contrasts with Trump's chaos. Which response is right for this moment, in your view, Congressman?
Reverend, allow me to just use this metaphor. When I leave here, I'm in Houston, to go to Washington, D.C., I'll take a plane. There are some persons who may go by train if they choose. Others may go by car. The vehicle is not really the question that we have to cope with as much as it is the destination. We're all moving toward the same destination. Some will choose a different vehicle. I think that we have to, at this point, have a combination. We have to have the litigation. We have to have legislation proposed, even if it doesn't pass. And then we have to have some agitation. I think that all three will give us the opportunity to metamorphose into a message that will make a difference. And I think that this will give us the opportunity to reclaim the House. I really believe it. And when we do, then we will have the opportunity to set the agenda.
And when you say we will set the agenda, I note that your tie says we the people. Now, yes, let me go to this issue. Nearly 200, I repeat, cases of measles have been identified by the Texas Department of State Health Services in an outbreak that has persisted in the western part of the state for 2 months now. One unvaccinated child has died, the first measles death in 9 years. Roughly 24 people have been hospitalized. And the state is warning that the outbreak will spread as another unvaccinated person has now died from an outbreak in neighboring New Mexico. Despite all of that, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is worrying doctors by not emphasizing vaccination and by promoting fish oil and vitamins to combat a highly infectious disease. Are you confident that this administration is doing everything it can to help fight this outbreak?
I'm confident that this administration is not, N-O-T, not doing everything that it can. And I'm so pleased, Reverend, thank you so much for bringing this up. We have children at risk, And we are seeing something that is growing in terms of the numbers. I would hope that Mr. Kennedy would step forward and would encourage people to understand that there is a means by which your children can be protected. I have been vaccinated, and if need be, I'll be vaccinated again. I believe that we should not allow ourselves to take up these snake oil remedies for something that science has proven to have a remedy for. At one time, we thought we had eliminated measles in this country. Now we find ourselves having to fight that fight again, and it's because of people like Mr. Kennedy. I would hope that he would change and that this administration would save lives as opposed to promoting things that can be harmful to children.
Now, on a sad note, tonight, Politics Nation joins Texas Democrats in the city of Houston in mourning late Congressman and former Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner, who died at the age of 70 this week. He was on this very show just 2 days earlier before his death, and just months after he won the seat held by the late Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Is there anything you want to share in the Congressman's memory?
Please, thank you. He was more than a great state representative who served for more than a quarter of a century, more than a great mayor, served for 8 years. He was truly a great human being, a great public servant. He had a hand of friendship for everyone that he could help. He got us through Hurricane Harvey. He helped us through many of the storms of life, however, that we confront here and across the globe. I just want people to know that he was a person whose life ought to be celebrated. And to his family and friends, I send my deepest condolences. And I'll always remember him for his great oratory. And when he would reach his crescendo at the end of his speech, he would always say, "To God be the glory for the things he has done." I say, to God be the glory for allowing us to have some time with the Honorable Sylvester Turner.
On that, I want to thank you, Texas Congressman Al Green.
Joining me now, we have Democratic Congresswoman from Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's a member of the House Appropriations Committee and a good friend to us. Welcome back to the show, Congresswoman. So, based on what has been put forth by Republicans, are we headed for a government shutdown at midnight Friday?
That ball is in Republicans' court. I mean, they control everything, the House, the Senate, the White House. If they're going to ram through this Republican funding scheme, which really horrifically hurts veterans, Donald Trump is basically the worst president in history for veterans. He's cut more veteran jobs than any president in history. They're going to ram through a continuing resolution for the rest of the fiscal year that essentially gives Donald Trump and Elon Musk, the unelected billionaire, a blank check with virtually no instructions to continue to make massive cuts, fire veterans, close Social Security offices, have the number of employees in the Social Security Department, withhold $23 billion from our veterans, and open the door to Social Security benefit cuts. That is outrageous, unnecessary, and certainly Democrats are not going to stand idly by and just go along with that. We can pass full-year bills. The Appropriations Committee, we're ready. I know the Republicans are ready. They need to let us do our work.
Listening to you, I used the word crazy in a segment just a short while ago, and I'm going to say again, it sounds crazy. Do you really think that Republicans are going to cut these services that are so important to so many of their own voters?
Let's see. We need 3 brave Republicans to join Democrats to stop this maniacal train wreck that the Republicans have commandeered. I mean, Alex, this is not a clean continuing resolution bill. Let me just be clear. They are, like I said, opening the door to closing half the Social Security offices, firing thousands of Social Security employees, reneging on $23 billion in veterans' medical care. The list goes on of all the things that they're doing to cut the legs out from under vulnerable people and our veterans. And it doesn't have to be this way. We can even pass a short-term CR, a couple days. I know that the leadership of our appropriations committees were close very close to a top line agreement, and we should just sit down and give us a little more room to finish the rest of the job, because otherwise, without the instructions and the direction from Congress, Alex, of full year bills, then Trump and Musk can run roughshod and have their way in virtually every agency. And that's unacceptable. Stand for that.
I want to pick up on that because Congress, quote, holds the power of the purse or maintains control over government spending. But we've all watched Elon Musk and Doge make these significant cuts across government agencies. You are a member of the House Appropriations Committee. So how concerned are you about Congress appearing at least to lose some of that power?
Well, it's not just that we're going to lose it. It's that Mike Johnson and the Republicans in the House and in the Senate are allowing it to happen. I mean, they're allowing unlawful, unconstitutional rummaging and cutting and firing across the federal government. Now, thankfully, we're fighting back as Democrats in Congress, in the community, and in the courts, the 3 Cs, and we're making progress. The courts have stopped a lot of these cuts, or at least slowed them down. Now, hopefully, the Trump administration is going to adhere to those court decisions. But we have to make sure that Republicans' constituents use their voices to oppose these indiscriminate firings. Veterans, Alex, have served our country. When they come back, they deserve the smooth transition to being civilians, jobs that we committed to give them preference for. And for Donald Trump's special advisor said that the veterans that they are firing don't deserve their jobs. The disrespect and disregard for our nation's veterans from Trump and Musk and MAGA Republicans is appalling.
With all the news of tariffs and the uncertainty in the economy as a result, what are your constituents telling you? I mean, how concerned are they?
Look, people are very concerned that we're headed towards a recession. I know the cheerleading that went on from Trump's advisors this weekend. Trump himself refused yesterday to rule out that we would have a recession. He's now warning, there's no rosy picture he's painting. Now he's warning that there's going to be pain before we supposedly see the benefits from his policies. The pain is happening right now, and it's devastating people. The uncertainty of tariffs on, tariffs off. This is no way to run a rodeo. I mean, we need corporations, small businesses, families need certainty. One day he's levying tariffs, the next day he's taking them off. Now he's promising to levy them on April 2nd. No wonder the stock market is plummeting and jobs. This is a president who is dealing with more businesses cutting jobs than jobs being created. That's a reversal of how it was during the Biden administration. And the blame is
all the king's horse's ass and all the king's men have been lining up to pay tribute. This week, a Republican congressman introduced legislation to put Trump's face on a $100 bill. But not to be outdone, another Republican lawmaker wants to go even higher than the $100, proposing legislation to design a $250 bill featuring Donald Trump. Okay, it gets even crazier. There's also a push to make Trump's birthday a federal holiday, rename Dulles Airport after him, and carve his face into Mount Rushmore. But of course, the biggest gesture of them all may be Senator Lindsey Graham, who posted this after Trump's joint address. Trump 2028. Yes, that is United States Senator Graham jumping on the unconstitutional bandwagon and endorsing a third Trump term. So we know Trump sees himself as a king. We know the party sees him as a king as well. But how do our federal courts see it? Well, we got the answer to that question late this week when a federal judge reversed Trump's firing of a member of the National Labor Relations Board. Here's part of the ruling. An American president is not a king, not even an elected one. A president who touts an image of himself as a king or a dictator, perhaps as his vision of effective leadership, fundamentally misapprehends the role under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Amen to that. I guess the Constitution still matters, folks. Joining me now, former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh, an incoming senior Washington correspondent and co-host for MSNBC, my buddy Eugene Daniels. Joe, I couldn't help but notice your head nodding there throughout that. I'm just going to let you address those scenarios from the $250 bill to Mount Rushmore to, a third Trump term.
It's too easy to have fun with this. But, Michael, this is scary shit, pardon me, on a Sunday morning. And Lindsey Graham there, a United States Senator, you don't joke about that.
Right.
Trump's what, 78, 79 years old? I have no doubt that if Trump could, he would try to run again. I think, Michael, the biggest failure of all of us during this Trump era has been the failure of imagination. Mm-hmm. We have not imagined how bad and how low he'd go. He tried to overthrow an American election 4 years ago. I have no doubt that he could try to stop the midterm elections. If he's physically able, he may try to run again in 28. This is really scary.
It is scary, Eugene, and you've covered Trump for quite a bit. Contrast your understanding, appreciation, if you will, of Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 in light of what is now put on the table, this imperial presidency that he's trying to create.
Yeah, I think what folks are seeing, what you saw on Tuesday in his joint address, is that Trump 1.0 was being stopped from doing some of these things, right? The people that were around him, the Republicans who had grown up in the RNC, who had been a part of your RNC at one point, all of those folks saw an end to Trumpism. They saw, okay, at some point, whether it's 4 or 8 years, we're going to have a Republican Party that looks like what we're used to. That's not the case anymore. So that means people get on the Trump train. And the Trump train includes, nowadays, people who are either true believers that work with him in the White House or don't see their jobs as trying to stop him from doing anything. They're not going to take things off the Resolute desk like happened in Trump 1.0. They're not going to stop him from doing things. If he wants to do something, they're going to find ways for him to do it, right? That is something that you hear over and over and over again from folks. And I've talked to a lot of people, and one thing that stuck out to me was on the 19th, before they got in, someone who was going into the DOJ and is now there said that they're ready to test the boundaries and stretch them, right? And I said, well, which boundaries? And they said all of them, right? And so it is about all of those things. And so that's the difference between 1.0 and 2.0. The people around him don't see themselves as needing to stop anything. They want to go.
They're there to advance it. They're there to give more meaning and purpose, sort of making it more official, Joe, in many respects. And you see that, I think, in this cabinet meeting, where at one point Trump, just has to sort of check, I guess, Elon Musk and says, the cabinet members, you guys are in charge. You get to decide. He just gets to advise. How much of that, what does that say to you about how Trump is looking at, to what Eugene just said, looking at how he wants these scenarios to play out in these various agencies? That pitter-pat between Marco and Elon really was just, sort of slinging between the two men. But at the end of the day, I think Trump is going to allow Elon to sling a little bit more than Rubio. But how do you see it? Even though he says, you are in charge, Rubio.
No, I agree with you, Michael. I think Trump views Elon as the man.
Yeah.
Elon as the man to do his dirty work. In a weird way, you can't blame Trump for feeling like he's a king. We talk about a king. What is that? Somebody who believes they're above the law and they're not accountable. Well, you can't blame Trump. Look at all he's gotten away with, and no one's ever held him accountable. Right. And here he sits in the White House. He's got no legislative branch to worry about. The Republican Party is his.
Right.
Who's going to stop him? The courts, the people? He feels untouchable right now.
And that's the part I find the most frustrating, Eugene. I mean, you're on the Hill. You're around about D.C. You're seeing these players in the quiet spaces, right? We'll talk about those quiet spaces, right? And they're leveling up what they really think and what they really feel. And what kills me about that is everyone to a person would say, oh, this is awful. We can't let this happen. Dude, you have the power to stop it. How do you see that? I mean, how come they can't say, oh, well, wait a minute, there are 10, 20, 30, 50 of us in Congress who don't want to see the Department of Education blown up, or we don't want to see USAID go away because of its, that's part of our soft power. No, Mr. President. What happens?
You're going to be shocked, but they are saying different things in front of the camera. They're saying just behind closed doors. What I hear often from Republicans is they're hopeful that they won't have to stand up to him because they're scared of what happens. They think that, let the courts handle it, right? They think that the courts will shake things out, the things that he really wants that they see as unconstitutional, these Republicans. They're like, the courts will handle that. We won't have to worry about it because they're worried about their families. They're worried about the people that work for them. Because it's not just, Donald Trump is going to send a mean Truth Social post about you, right? It is that you're going to start getting death threats from folks that are his followers. You're going to start your kid who is going to college, someone may bother them. Those are the kinds of things they're thinking about. And I want to add just really quickly on that cabinet meeting, what I found most interesting wasn't that Donald Trump likes to, pit people against and have that fight, which is also fascinating and has been a part of his whole life, but mostly that it was clear that he was hearing from these cabinet members that they were getting frustrated with how much Elon was able to do and is able to do. And so that moving forward is something that folks should keep watching, right? Marco Rubio was kind of the first one because of US aid and what Elon did over there. And there's a lot of frustration within the cabinet about how Elon Musk has been able to run roughshod across their departments and agencies quickly with reckless abandon and with 20-year-olds doing it when they thought that they would be doing the job of a cabinet secretary.
Yeah.
But they're pretty quiet about it.
Poor little cabinet members. I feel so bad for you. So to you, Joe, on Eugene's point about the courts being the bulwark against all of this, we saw the side eyes and the horrific response to Comey Barrett about Amy Comey Barrett at that Capitol Hill event. What say you? She's been an independent player. In many respects, she and the Chief Justice sometime align on rulings. What to expect there?
The king will defy a court order.
That's the next piece of this.
Michael, the king's going to defy the Supreme Court. Yeah. And then what does the Republican Party do? I mean, the king...
Well, then, not the party. What the hell does the country do?
Right. Right now, the king is standing with Putin and standing against the free world, and the party's quiet. When the king defies the Supreme Court, what does the country do?